Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cem Karayalçın, and I'm a professor in and the chair of the Department of Economics at FIU. I'm also a professor in the Master of Arts in Global Affairs program. Welcome to our webinar, The Impacts of the Current Crisis on International Development. This webinar is presented by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series in collaboration with the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and the Master of Arts in Global Affairs program, which is now launching a brand new track in international development for those interested in pursuing a graduate degree. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and Florida International University have been at the forefront of exploring different implications of the disease from topics that include health, global economic implications, and cybersecurity, with a variety of experts from the school, the university, and beyond. Today's webinar focuses on the international development dimension of the pandemic. To cover these topics, I'm joined by four experts. Dr. Alexander Crowther is a visiting professor with a dual appointment in both the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Dr. Crowther is also an integral part of FIU's emerging preeminent program, Cybersecurity at FIU. Dr. Crowther has a PhD in International Development from Tulane University and spent 25 years living overseas, working on these issues from the local to the national and regional and global levels. Dr. Shen Guo is an instructor of economics for the Department of Economics at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. He's an applied economist with a PhD from the University of Chicago with teaching and research interests in macroeconomics and labor economics. Dr. Abu-Shan Choi is an assistant professor for the Department of Economics at the Stephen J. Green School. He is an applied economist with interests in issues of global development with a focus on evidence-based policy research. And finally, Dr. Hakan Yılmaz Kuday is a professor in the Department of Economics at the Stephen J. Green School. His research focuses on several fields, including international trade and finance, economic growth and development, as well as monetary economics. He is currently working on the spread of COVID-19 and its economic consequences. But before we begin, I would like to make an additional announcement. The Master of Arts in Global Affairs program, which is co-sponsoring this event, has extended its deadline for fall 2020 applications, and I encourage you to apply. As you'll hear today, the COVID-19 pandemic will have major repercussions on the world, and a global affairs degree can provide you with the needed know-how and skills set to understand these implications and their policy consequences. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, the experts you'll be hearing from today are actively engaged in this program. In addition to the website for the program, you'll find an email address in the chat feature to which you can send questions. Okay, let's begin. By the way, audience members, I encourage you to send us your questions via the chat feature. We'll take as many questions as we can and incorporate into the panel discussion. So I'll start with Dr. Shen Guo. And my first question is, what is the nature of the damage this COVID-19 pandemic caused to affected economies? Has your view changed since the last FIU panel discussion in January 2020?
Thanks, Cem. Very nice to be here. So I think the basic nature of this COVID-19 pandemic to the economy, we call this a shock to the economy, is basically it separates consumers from consumption goods and services, and worse, so it displaces workers from workplace. So this abruptly halts the specializations and the trades that are essential to a healthy economy. So I found that economic coma is a very accurate word to capture that situation. As we study with economic students, we all know that specialization and traits dated back from the era of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They are the basic elements of economic growth. And now because of this virus, because of this pandemic, the degree of the specialization and the traits are constrained. So we kind of go back towards certain degree of autonomy, and we know that that is not good for economic growth. And so in the short run, basically the best public health policy is also the best economic policy, which is trying to contain the spread of the virus as soon as possible, even if the economic activities have to be halted. But in the long run, in the medium and the long run, the quarantine and the lockdown policies interfere with the resumption of the economic activities. So we have this delicate job of, on one hand, we have to practice social distancing to slow down the spread of the virus. On the other hand, we have to try our best to get back to normal economic activities. So that's the basic nature of the COVID-19 pandemic to the economy, the shock to the economy. And since January 2020, at that time I thought this could be contained, okay? Because in China, this was not the first time that such virus emerged within their border. They had the SARS, they had the bird flus, they had these kind of episodes before. And it seems like the outside world are not affected too much by the outbreak of those episodes. But this time is different. I was a little struck by the lack of preparedness of the United States, even if given the advanced notice of that has already happening in China, but we still find that there's a lack of adequate preparedness for this to hit the United States. So that's where we find ourselves in a current situation. And so, if the outbreak only lasts like several months, I would say that's temporary shock. I would bet most likely to the V-shaped recovery, but it lasted more than couple of months. And as I said, we see no end to the resolve of this crisis by the end of the summer, then we are entering a phase which I would call the temporary shock has transitioned into some kind of permanent shock. So we have to live through that. And that will cause the damage to the economy. And everyone has to be prepared for such a scenario.
So what about the skyrocketing number of people who have lost their jobs in the US and other countries as well? Why has the financial market then taken so well with the unemployment numbers so far?
Well, Jen, we know that the stock market is a leading indicator. It usually looks into the future, look forward to the future of the economy for about 6 to 9 months ahead. And we know that only active investors, by this I mean those who buy and sell stocks in the market, presumably in larger amounts, only them can express their views of the economy. I mean, even if my view of the economy is gloomy, but since I don't engage in transaction in the stock market, my view is not expressed in a market. So that being said, there are several things that we need to look into when we see the divergence of the stock market performance versus the labor market. For one thing, the stock market is pricing a gradual recovery in a fall, assuming that the vaccine will be basically available and there's no large-scale second wave of the virus coming back. Okay, so that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. That's what the investors think. Okay, whether we agree or not. The second factor regarding the stock market is that we know that Federal Reserve has injected massive liquidity into the market. It has injected more than 2 trillions since March, and its balance sheet has increased from 2.2 trillions in 2008 to up to 6.6 trillions by now. So that's a lot of the liquidity in the market, and some of them must have found their place in the stock market. And that's the second factor. And as for the labor market, the raw numbers show that there are more than 20 million workers who lost their jobs. It is worrisome. And the unemployment rate has climbed up to more than 14%. That's certainly not anything that we have usually seen in the economy. That being said, we must remember that in this time of uncertainty regarding how soon that economy will be back to the normal, how soon the vaccine will be available, and also how soon different states will reopen according to their own schedule. All these kind of things will pose the uncertainty on the businesses. So from the business point of view, it is to their best interest to shed the labor force right now to make sure that they survive. And by the time that this crisis passed, they can come back as quickly as possible to recruit those workers and put the business back to normal. So right now, I think it makes sense for government to take the main task of supporting those who are unemployed and to make sure that they can live through these difficult times. But all in all, what I say regarding the divergence of the stock market and the labor market is that stock market is looking into the future for the kind of recovery that in the best scenario that we would see, and at the same time, for the labor cost is basically shouldered, that the cost is shouldered by the government and the in a form of a social safety net, and that's why we see that there's this divergence.
I see. So do you think the central banks are doing enough to fight the COVID-19 problems?
As far as I see from the Federal Reserve Bank, the main task for Federal Reserve Bank, especially in the United States, is to make sure that there's no separate financial crisis on top of an economic crisis we are seeing. So that's a kind of the main task it is aiming for. And in terms of its ability, we know that the Federal Reserve has unlimited power in printing the money, as long as the inflation is under arrest. In this sense, the United States is in a unique position compared to other countries, because the dollars is the major currency in the world, and it's a safe haven access when time gets tough. Okay, so the Federal Reserve basically has unlimited ability to put up the support to the economy, to inject the liquidity into the economy, to make sure that there's no financial crisis that will emerge at the same time when we are in this difficult economic crisis stage. That being said, we understand that the Federal Reserve does not have vaccine. So ultimately, we couldn't only rely on Federal Reserve to do this, to make sure that this recovery will happen very quickly. And just like Chairman Powell has said the other day, he expects that the government and the Congress will do their job as well. And the Federal Reserve basically will watch the back of the market and make sure that there's no panic and there's enough liquidity in the market as far as it is concerned. And Jim, I just want to add that given the Federal Reserve's the ability to buy all kinds of bonds and security it wants to do, it may sound unthinkable to us that Federal Reserve should do this in an unprecedented degree to support the market. But you are the monetary expert. You know that there's this kind of modern monetary theory that exactly advocates doing that. If what they are doing right now can make long-term returns without incurring hyperinflation, without incurring the higher interest rates or higher taxation down the road, why not do it? So I'm pretty confident about the ability of the Federal Reserve. Now it's just we're trying to find the best combination of monetary policies and fiscal policies to make it work.
Great, thank you very much for your insight. There is a question for you in the question and answer. Do you see it, or should I read it to you?
I haven't seen it right here. Max, where is it?
The question, I can read it to you. The question is, by Jessica Lasso, who says, I would like to confirm if what Dr. Guo stated is that COVID has been found to spread in China through water and sources. Thank you.
Actually, I have no knowledge about how the virus is spread. I heard about all kinds of things, how all kinds of channels that the virus can be spread. But I think this is best left for public health experts and doctors to talk about rather than economists.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the answer. Now, my next questions are to Dr. Hakan Yılmazkuray, who has been carrying out research on the spread of COVID-19, mostly through the US. So, Dr. Yılmazkuray, do you think the stay-at-home orders work to fight against the COVID-19 spread?
So hello everyone, and thanks for having me. So can we put up my slides if possible? Page number 2. I will start to, using them through our chat. Okay, so I have been working on the spread of COVID-19 and whether or not the stay-at-home orders have been working to fight against the spread of COVID-19. In one of my studies, I have been using this Google mobility data, as you might have heard about it. So Google collects data from all of our cell phones, whether we are at home, whether we go to any retail place, or we are in a transit station, just like a subway or a bus station. So wherever we are, this data is collected by Google. And Google has made this particular data set at the country level for 130 countries around the world. So I took this data set coming from Google Mobility, and then I combined it with the COVID-19 cases and COVID-19 deaths. So based on my formal investigation, which is based on a difference in different design, which means that we are controlling for all potential country-specific factors, we are controlling for time-specific factors which are changing over time. After controlling for these factors, I just found out that if we have more mobility, we have higher COVID-19 cases and we have higher COVID-19 deaths. So in this particular slide that you see on the screen, there is a blue line, which is representing the number of cases in countries with less mobility. And we have the date on the horizontal axis, and we have the number of COVID cases in total on the vertical axis. As you see here, if we have fewer mobility, if we have less mobility, this dramatically reduces the number of COVID-19 cases. Although I don't have the corresponding diagrams here, the same statement is also correct when we consider the COVID-19 deaths in these 130 countries. And just compare that blue line with what we have in that, maybe that orange line. The orange line represents the countries or the COVID-19 cases in countries where we have more mobility. So if people have been more mobile, meaning that if they have been going to retail places, if they have been going to recreation places like theaters or any other recreation places, as well as if they have been going to transit stations, although I don't have the graphs here, if they have been going to their workplaces, all of these, they have been increasing the number of COVID-19 cases. So long story short, we should be staying at home as much as we can. And I would like to connect this particular research also to the latest developments that we have from the United States. As you may have been following the news, certain states, pretty much all of them now, they have been opening the business, right? So as the business are getting opened, of course, we may be very cautious about what we are achieving here. We would like to compare the states which are opening up their businesses with those other states which have sort of delayed opening up their businesses. This is sort of an ongoing research that I have, and this is going to be sort of the next step of my research that you see on the screen. And I would like to see what is going to happen next in terms of opening up for the business, because so everybody's talking about this sort of a trade-off, right? Should we go ahead and stay at home? But on the other side, the cost is that we are losing a lot of economic activity. So for how long can we handle this particular staying at home situation? So these are the things that we should put together and then, have more research about in the future. So can we move on to my next slide, please? Because the next slide, which is page number 3, as you see, this is a very similar study that I achieved, this time by using data coming from US counties. So this is pretty much very similar to what I did by using Google mobility data. Instead of using Google mobility, I'm using a cell phone mobility data coming from another source, but the idea is pretty much the same. If you travel across US counties, you are increasing the chances of getting the COVID-19 virus. This is also true for the COVID-19 deaths. As you see here, we again have 2 lines. The blue line is representing the counties which have less mobility. Those are the counties at which people usually stay at the very same county. They don't travel to other counties. So this is sort of an investigation based on inter-county travel. So we are living in Miami-Dade County. If I go to Broward, am I increasing the chances of getting sick? The answer is yes. And the answer is yes, even after controlling for the factors that are Miami-Dade specific, that are Broward County specific, and that are also changing over time. So my research tells pretty much to stay at home as much as we can. I know that the trends are going down in terms of the COVID-19 cases and deaths, but that does not mean anything about the effectiveness of staying at home. So I should stop here, otherwise I will continue talking forever. Okay.
So my next question then, thank you for this, is about the differential effects. across groups. So which demographic groups have achieved more social distancing? I think you have some research on that as well.
Exactly, Jem. Thanks again for asking about it. So again, the corresponding slide is on the screen right now. And this is sort of another data set coming from the states in the United States. And as you can see here, the data set that I have now distinguishes between people coming from different neighborhoods. Some of these neighborhoods are having, they have higher income levels. Some of these neighborhoods, they have lower income levels. These are blocks. You know, think about a block in a city. You know, certain blocks in a city may be richer than others. And based on the census data collected maybe 1 or 2 years ago, you can combine the information coming from these blocks with the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths again. So as you see in this particular picture, I observe whether or not this social distancing is achieved in a different way across demographic groups. In this particular picture, I show what's going on between different income levels. As you see, as the income level goes up, people were able to achieve more social distancing. So if I'm coming from a higher income neighborhood, I was able to achieve social distancing. But if I'm coming from a lower income neighborhood, which is represented by either the orange line or the blue line, as you see here, those guys, they have been interacting more with each other. Because in this particular diagram, I am showing the social interaction in the vertical axis just to make sure that we are at the same page. So the social interaction for the lower income people starting from March 15, they have been even more compared to their long run trend measured back in January or February, meaning that these lower income people, they in fact had to be more outside, interacting more with other people in terms of their in terms of the location of their cell phone, right? Because this data is again collected through their cell phone wherever they are, whether or not they come up together with some other people in terms of interacting with other cell phones, so to speak. From this perspective, yes, demographic information is a very important indicator of social distancing. And this is also true for the demographic categorization between the lower educated people versus higher educated people. As you can guess, lower educated people, again, they are experiencing less social distancing, whereas higher educated people, they have been experiencing more social distancing. So in order to connect this to my previous comment or previous research based on staying at home works to fight against the COVID-19 spread. So the idea is, yes, it works against fighting against the spread, but can we all achieve it? The answer is no, which means that we have to think along these lines. Maybe demographic specific policies should be in order just to make sure that we can all utilize these stay-at-home orders just to stay safe. I'm not saying this because maybe I'm not talking about these future forthcoming potential policies only based on the summertime, but think about the case when we'll open up our campus in the fall, right? You know, we should definitely be taking this information into account when we will potentially have the second wave or this COVID-19 and think through these details in our policy making.
Thank you for this. So what do you think are what do you find are the effects of COVID-19 on economic activity in general? Are policymakers, say, central banks doing enough?
Yeah, so first of all, let me start with, what I found based on an economic model that I have. So I'm mostly an international trade economist. So based on my, let's say, trade knowledge, the knowledge of my trade literature, right, the knowledge of the trade literature, I put together a trade model, which is an economic model that many economics students, have seen in their textbooks in a very, let's say, simple way. So based on the model that I have, I was able to calculate the welfare loss of people due to not being able to, travel. across US countries. So think about it this way. As a person, I was able to travel to a bunch of other counties in my regular life before COVID-19. I could go to Broward County, I could go to Orange County, I could travel all over Florida or even other counties within the United States. Let's say that represents my typical welfare. Now I'm taking that typical welfare as my benchmark case, and I would like to compare that welfare with the current situation in which I cannot travel as much as I used to before COVID-19. So based on this particular modeling and putting all the mobility data together, I ended up with this welfare investigation where I show that the welfare costs of reduced mobility, they are about 10%. So on average, we lost about 10% of our welfare during this COVID-19. This is only because of the welfare that we are losing out of our mobility. Forget about the unemployment, forget about a bunch of other welfare losses through our bank accounts. But this is something that we have only because of the lack of mobility or only because of the reduced mobility. Can we move further in our slides? This is another study that I have in which I have a look at the relationship between the coronavirus disease, the COVID-19, and the global economy. This is a very short paper that I have where I show that as the number of cases in China, they go up, we end up with having a reduction in our overall global economic activity, again, after controlling for a bunch of other factors that you can think of. Right, so do I have a question? I just saw something. Hello?
Actually, it's a salutation. So.
Oh, hello, Andre. So, okay, so let's move on to the next slide so that I can cover more topics. So this is the effects on the global economy based on this time. Yeah, that was the global economy. This time, in this particular slide, I'm showing you the effects of the COVID-19 cases on the S&P 500 index. As you see here, again, after controlling for many other factors, we observe, of course, we know that there is a negative impact on the S&P 500 index, but the question that I answer here is by how much, right? As we have 1,000 more cases in the US, this is exactly pretty much what we have in our S&P 500 index. As a result, this is the response of the index to 1,000 of an increase in US cases. And the vertical axis is representing the numbers in percentage terms. Please go ahead to the next slide. And this particular slide answers your question based on the monetary policy, whether or not the central banks are doing enough. The answer is no. They are not doing enough as much as they can. And the reason is most of the developed economies, I'm talking about the advanced countries like the European Union countries, United States, Australia. Think about the advanced economies, Canada, right? These countries, have a look at this picture, the figure that I have. The blue line represents those advanced countries of which central banks have a zero bound regarding their policy rate. What is that supposed to mean? It means that they are already having interest rates very close to zero. They cannot lower it anymore. So, of course, the typical, regular monetary policy doesn't work as much as it is supposed to work. This is exactly why many central banks around the world, they are using alternative monetary policies, as we call them, unconventional monetary policies in terms of purchasing assets, purchasing treasury bills, intervening into long-run interest rate markets, just to make sure that all of these markets have enough liquidity. But a short answer to your question is the central banks cannot achieve as much as they can just because of the fact that we were caught to this COVID-19 with already low interest rates. Whenever I say interest rate, I'm talking about the policy rate of the central banks. In our case, for the United States, it is the federal funds rate, as our students might remember. A couple of more slides as far as I can see here. So, as you may remember, the oil market, right? The crude oil prices, we even started observing negative prices. What is that supposed to mean? It means that, these oil producers or oil storage places, they would like to pay you so that you can take their extra oil out of their storage place because they don't have any more space. So certain things are going on in this oil market. And in one paper of mine, I wanted to see the effects of these volatilities in the oil prices on the gasoline prices that we pay as the consumers at the retail level. So whenever I go to the gas station, how much of the reduction in the crude oil prices I observe as a consumer? The answer is only about 28%. So maybe oil prices go down by 50%, I only observe about 15% of that reduction. So this is something to think about in terms of how, as we call it in technical terms, the pass-through issues work on. Let me see, I think we have a question. Is it possible to reduce all oil extraction during this time? I think it is possible, as far as I have been following on the news. But the idea is, these markets, they usually have certain deadlines to get involved into agreements with other parties. Say that there is a deadline for next month's future market. Let's say that it is today. So whatever we observe in terms of the negative oil prices is only for the specific day, because today is the deadline for having agreements for future oil sales, right? So once we pass this particular deadline day, the oil prices may go back to the regular levels, meaning that we are back into the regular oil market. From that perspective, we do not need to shut down the oil extraction. I think we should continue as long as we have enough storage place. And this has been an issue only for the United States, as you may remember. This was not the case. This was not a problem in the rest of the world, where we can talk about the Brent oil prices, which is another international index for crude oil prices. I think I'm going to stop here. I don't want to take any more time of other panelists.
Thank you so much.
So
yeah,
thanks again for having me and giving me a chance to answer your questions.
Thank you for all this fascinating information. Now I'll go on to Dr. Krautzer, who will talk about the interaction between developed and developing countries during the COVID crisis. So my first question is, how has this global pandemic impacted the ability or the desire of developed countries like US and UK to provide development assistance to the developing world?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the panel. The developed world is suffering from donor fatigue, right? Ever since 9/11, we've pumped an incredible amount of money into developing countries. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? But our budget isn't that big in the United States. We're running at about $40 billion a year now. That was 2019 for foreign aid. So that's 0.2% or 0.2% of our budget. 40% of it goes to 10 countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously. The next two are Israel and Jordan, and then there's 5 African countries and Pakistan. I think we no longer desire to support these countries. We're already unhappy with Iraq and talking about pulling out there. We're down to next to nothing in Syria. We're putting money into the northeastern part of Syria, but there's sanctions against the Syrian government. President Trump has ordered everybody out of Afghanistan before the election. So I think what you're going to see is, and you heard our Dr. Sheng Guo talk about huge deficits, right? We ran $1 trillion deficit last year. We're going to run a $3 trillion deficit this year so far. Who knows how big the deficit is going to be this year. Tax income is way down because, as my two colleagues have mentioned, economic activity is way down. So I think you're going to see a lot of pressure to not perhaps eliminate foreign assistance, but certainly to neck it down.
How about the international development community, like the IMFs, the World Banks? How about their ability and or desire to help the developing economies?
Well, they want to help, but the pressing emergency is the raging budget deficits that everybody's facing because of the coronavirus. So now I think you're going to see for the next year or two them trying to prop up governments around the world. What you're seeing is, for instance, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has lent huge amounts of money throughout Asia and Africa, and now you're seeing countries that are talking with China. There's a lot of pressure on China to write off all that money. Chinese are not hot on that because, of course, they have their own economic problems back at home. On the other hand, the Chinese have been caught with their hand in the till in that countries that have not been able to pay their debts to China in the past, China has taken over chunks of their infrastructure, like a port in Sri Lanka and a port in Mombasa in Kenya. So I think that a lot of the international organizations aren't going to be focusing so much on investments in say education or countering corruption, and much more in just keeping governments afloat.
So the other side of the equation, how about the developing countries themselves? Are they willing to ask, or how has their attitude towards foreign aid changed, or their willingness to accept aid from whatever?
I think they're willing to accept aid from just about anybody at this point, right? I mean, these are countries. You know, my two colleagues talked about the fact that the American government can print money, right? And other countries have better balance sheets. But when you get into Africa and Asia and some Western Hemisphere countries, such as Haiti, Venezuela, of course, because of sanctions, you're looking at economies that are being destroyed, right? And the ability of the government to govern, they can't pay for anything. And so I don't think they're interested in aid for education, or of course, they've never liked getting aid to get rid of corruption. But I think they just want as much money as they can get their hands on from anybody just to keep their governments afloat.
Thank you so much for the insights. So I am now going to move on to Dr. Abu Shonchoy, who is actually doing partially field work in the developing economies concerning the COVID-19 pandemic. So my first question to you, Dr. Shonchoy, is lacking widespread testing capacity, most developing countries, which are resource constrained, how do they identify potential COVID-19 hotspots? What do they do?
Right. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak in the panel. So this is a great question, Jim. As we know that in developing countries, they have tremendous resource constraint in terms of the testing abilities, whatever we have in USA, which is also not adequate. Compared to many other countries, developing countries are lacking enormous amount of resources to test appropriately. So we have been seeing that there are rationing of testing, and there are some certain protocols that who can be tested and who cannot be tested. And also the testing capacity per million population in different countries are very different. So just to give you a perspective, like in countries like Bangladesh, they're testing 15 people per million. In India, it is like 21 people per million. Whereas if you compare that with South Korea, they are testing extremely high amount of people. Like, I mean, South Korea is like the champion or leader in terms of testing. Now, the one crucial question, which is like whenever we talk about social distancing or talking about flattening the curve, one important issue is to know how much is the disease spread and where will be the next outbreak hotspot. Like, how can I know that, like New York, which will be the city that will get this kind of potential hotspot? So because they don't have adequate data, so what I thought that might be useful, which is using the stock of migration variables. So can I go to the next slide, please? So the idea is very simple. So developing countries have many people working in various parts of the world. And because of the COVID-19 situation and the pandemic, many of these countries are laying off their foreign workers. And these foreign workers are now coming back to their home. So when they're coming back home, they're also not only coming back home with the baggage, they're also carrying the disease with them. So the idea is very simple. So if we can know that which are the areas of the country where they have more migrant families or more migration population, so these will be the areas where the disease will spread faster. So I take the example of Bangladesh. So I start working with the Bangladesh government and try to show them that this might be a way to tackle the pandemic, just to know in advance that these are the areas where the next hotspot is coming, because they don't have enough testing capacity. So this is kind of an indirect inference that these are the areas where we might see the next hotspot for COVID-19. So in order to do that, what I have done is I had household level survey data of Bangladesh, and in that survey data, they had questions about whether you have a family member living abroad, and if the person is living abroad, which are the countries that they are currently staying. So from there, I created like a risk index. So comparing, like if somebody is living and working in Italy, that person or that families are much more vulnerable compared to somebody who is currently living in Mauritius, because Mauritius was not a COVID-19 hotspot, at least at that moment. So from there, we created this kind of heat map, which I'm showing in the picture. And what was amazing that when we show this heat map and then we overlay the current COVID-19 cases in that country, we saw that the correlation is very high. So the correlation based on different specification ranges from 0.50 to 0.65. So that means these national level household survey data, which is available to almost any country, they can use this kind of data to do a prediction analysis that where will be the areas I can probably expect to see the next pandemic to occur or the next hotspot to occur. So once we have done it, we also kind of a proof of concept test. In the next slide, please. So once we show this diagram, then the government of Bangladesh also shared multiple other data sources, which are really, really great data sources. One is like airport returnee data. So that is in the last 3 months, number of people who came through the national airport of Bangladesh, and they're like immigration cards. So from the immigration card, you can know that from which country these guys came from and where they are currently going. We also had migration permit data. We had quarantine data. We had distress call data from national hotline numbers. And also I conducted a rapid phone survey in one of the randomly picked districts of the country. So just to give you a long story short, all these data sources are extremely correlated with that national stock data. So that means for any developing countries, when they have lacking testing abilities, they can use national household survey to detect this kind of hotspots. And even though they don't have very sophisticated data like telephone tracking or what Professor Yilmaz Gudai used, like Google mobility data at the disaggregate or subnational level, or if they don't have cell tower data or other sophisticated data, this kind of national household level data can also work to give an indirect inference where the this disease outbreak would be.
So what sort of policy conclusions would the policymakers draw from this? I mean, these are essentially migrants coming in from abroad and I guess spreading the virus. What do you expect, or what is the hope that the policymakers do with this?
Right. So that's also a very good question. So the problem that developing countries face, as I mentioned, is the lack of resources. So when we did this analysis, and we also looked into the hospital capacity and ICU facilities and ventilation facilities, we saw that all these countries are lacking all these facilities. Now, knowing which areas I will be getting the outbreak, they can allocate the resources much more efficiently. So I can give you an anecdotal evidence of what happened in Bangladesh. So when the disease starts spreading, Chinese government and other government gave them some PCR testing kits. So say, for example, they got 1 million kits, and the government of Bangladesh was thinking of distributing these kits equally to all over the country. My analysis tells them that you don't need to distribute the kits equally to all the districts at this moment. You need to prioritize those areas where you will get the hit first, and then tackle that country and that states first, and then eventually move to other areas. So it will be extremely helpful for developing countries to know where the hotspot would be and allocate the resources properly. So that could be, lockdown measures, easing down the economic activities, or providing safety net support, conditional cash transfer program, medical facilities, testing facilities, or even ICU beds. Because they have limited resources, these would help them to prioritize which areas to allocate the resources now and which areas not to allocate at this moment. I can show you another two diagrams if I can show the next diagram. So we not only did it for Bangladesh, this kind of analysis, we extended this analysis for South Asia, and it's a pretty similar pattern. So it's not only like a Bangladesh phenomena that developing countries like Bangladesh, they have lots of immigrant population or migrant population, but may not be applicable for other countries. But these results and this analysis is extremely robust, even if I extend to the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. Even we have done it for developing countries. So then if I can show the next slide, please. In the next slide, we also did this kind of analysis and exposure for all the developing countries. So some developing countries have migrant population from like a lot of large amount of migrant population. So these countries are much more vulnerable, and they will see much faster disease spread compared to other countries where we don't see many migrant populations. So you can see on the left-hand side, these are high exposure countries like Mexico, India, Philippines, South Africa, Tanzania. They have a large volume of their own population living abroad compared to like countries like Puerto Rico and Bulgaria, Nigeria. So they will have a later stage of the disease spread and the outbreak compared to these high exposed countries.
Thank you. So, yeah, it seems like this is going to be extremely helpful in fighting the COVID-19 in developing countries who are even more resource constrained than the rich countries who find themselves anyway in rather tight situations to begin with. The budgets are falling everywhere, tax collections are low. So that takes me to actually an open question that we have. It might be that Hakan or Shane Go might be able to answer this question. James Brand says, state governors decided who was essential and not, and the nots, the non-essential ones, do pay taxes, and the states will all hurt because of this arrogance. My agency is essential but pays no taxes. So what do we say to that? Hakan, for instance.
Okay, hi again. So I think you have a very nice point here. So the idea is, as I tried to mention briefly during talking about my research, the idea here is to make sure that people are going to stay home as much as they can. But At the same time, this comes with the cost of not having enough economic activity. This is true not only for the essential business workers, but also for the non-essential business workers. I think policymakers are in a very tough decision situation here, where they have to decide on how people are going to survive if they are going to stay home. That is the first question to be handled, the first question to be answered. Once they are going to fix this very, let's say, immediate problem, then they can start talking about how can we fix the other economies or the other business, which are the non-essential business. I think most governments, they took this step-by-step approach. What is the problem in hand in the short term? The very short-term problem was that we have to stay home, and at the same time, we have to continue consuming the essentials. The essentials are usually the food, and if we have to, of course, go to the hospital, we are talking about the essential workers in the health system. So these are the essential workers, meaning that the priority was given to these businesses. That is for sure. And then once this immediate problem was solved, then the government started, all governments, all layers of governments, not only state governments, but we are talking about the government at the county level, at the city level, at the state level, all the governments around the world, they took this step-by-step approach. Once people got more used to the idea of having COVID-19 in our lives, right? Now they started thinking about what can we do step by step. The first step, open or keep the essential business open. The second step, make sure that people are going to get used to the idea so that the non-essential business can be opened phase by phase. What is that supposed to mean? It means that if we have enough reduction in the number of cases and in the number of deaths in a certain location, maybe this location is a good candidate for the non-essential businesses, the non-essential economic activity to go back to normal. And I think pretty much all states have been doing it so far. But again, I would like to still be very cautious here in terms of telling everybody that we should be staying at home, we should be taking precautions as much as we can. And then, of course, if we have to go out, then yes, you can start doing it by following all the guidelines and everything. But we should definitely be doing this step by step. And that step by step has been the reason behind this question asked.
Thank you, Hakan. Let me just remind you before we close, there's a remarkable difference between state and federal governments, right? Most state governments in the US are bound by their constitution to run balanced budgets. What that means is as their tax revenues fall during the epidemic, they are going to be forced to cut their expenditures. This means cutting back on services. This means laying off workers, policemen, policewomen, firefighters, teachers. And that will actually, through the ripple effect, make things even worse for the economy as a whole. Whereas the federal government can actually borrow and doesn't have to balance its budget. It's supposed to borrow and spend more than it collects in tax revenues during economic contractions, which is what we're going through now. And also, of course, there's the fact that the Federal Reserve can actually expand the money supply and monetize the debt that the federal government can run. So there is a much bigger role for the federal government to play here than the state governments do. Well, anyway, let me just for 2 seconds look at one last question, and this is from Marcela Machuca. Individuals and families need to continue consuming essential goods, but at the same time, they have no income and they come with a high short-term debt without collateral. And so how can we provide them help to avoid disruptions at the payment chain? So the federal government, the state government cannot do this, but the federal government has to expand its CARES program. It's programs to transfer income to poor families, to families who are struggling. And that is what the European governments are doing. That is what other developed economies are doing. And that's what this government has started to do, and that needs to be continued. Working from home definitely affects the economy because even though those who can work at home can keep themselves safe, others who are maybe more essential workers think medical professionals who cannot work from home, and that is a huge differential effect on both the health and income of those who are able to work from home and those who are not.
Can I add something to that question?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so I have seen a couple of research papers based on this particular question, and it has been shown that certain sectors, as you said, right, they can continue working from home, but certain other sectors, especially the service sector, cannot continue working from home. Based on that idea, certain economic activity should be affected or can be affected if we stay at home. For instance, the restaurants, the other service sector, like the health sector, whatever that cannot be achieved from the home is usually disappear as an economic activity if we all are going to stay at home. This is exactly the idea behind that sort of the trade-off between the economic activity and the health-related issues coming from COVID-19. So long story short, I think we should be having a look at this picture sector by sector. And if we can identify which sectors are more suitable for staying at home or working from home, then we are going to have an answer to your question.
Okay, well, since we have passed our time, so I'll have to end the discussion. I would like to thank all of the participants, including the panelists, for their insightful comments and all those who asked questions. I hope we have given you some of the answers, and hopefully we can do this again. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.